March 1942. Malta, Grand Harbour. A British light cruiser sits in dry dock, unable to move, while 2,000 Axis bomber sorties hammer the dockyard over 15 days. 3,000 tons of bombs fall on the harbour. 14 aerial torpedoes slice through the air above her. Her crew fires 6,500 rounds of 4-inch ammunition and 75,000 rounds of smaller calibre, shooting back from a ship that cannot sail. When the bombing finally pauses long enough to attempt repairs, dockyard workers discover hundreds of shrapnel holes punched through her hull, her decks, her superstructure. There are not enough welders on the entire island to patch them all, so they hammer rough wooden blocks and wedges into the holes instead. The cruiser bristles with protruding wooden pegs like a porcupine. Her crew gives her a new name, HMS Pepperpot. She should not be seaworthy. She should not survive. She escapes anyway. This is the story of HMS Penelope. To understand how Penelope ended up trapped in Malta's dockyard, you need to understand why the Royal Navy sent her there in the first place. By autumn 1941, the Mediterranean War had reached a crisis. Rommel's Africa Corps was being fed by convoy routes running from Italy directly to Libya, and those routes passed within 60 miles of Malta. The island sat astride the enemy's lifeline. If British forces at Malta could strangle those convoys, Rommel would starve. If the Axis could neutralise Malta, North Africa was theirs. The problem was capability. Malta needed surface warships aggressive enough to intercept convoys at night, but the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet had been bleeding ships for months. HMS Barham, a battleship, had been torpedoed and lost with over 800 men. Italian frogmen would soon cripple battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant at Alexandria. The fleet was running out of heavy units. Meanwhile, Axis convoys were delivering hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies to Rommel every month. Tanks, fuel, ammunition, all of it passing within 60 miles of Malta with growing confidence. The Admiralty's answer was not to send battleships it could not spare. It was to send 2 light cruisers and 2 destroyers. A force so small the Italians would not even consider it a serious threat. They called it Force K. Penelope was one of 4 Arethusa-class light cruisers built under the 1930 London Naval Treaty. The Admiralty needed maximum hulls for minimum tonnage, so the designers made a brutal trade. They deleted an entire gun turret. Where the preceding Leander class carried 8 6-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, the Arethusa class carried just 6 guns in 3 turrets, 50 feet shorter, 1,250 tons lighter. Welded construction, a first for British cruisers at this scale, shaved off another 250 tons. The result displaced just 5,220 tons standard, with a 57mm belt, tissue-thin armour by cruiser standards. On paper, she was outgunned by nearly every enemy cruiser in the Mediterranean. Italian condottieri types displaced 40 to 60% more, carried 8 guns to her 6, and were 2 knots faster. German Leipzig-class cruisers mounted 9 guns in triple turrets with double the torpedo armament. Critics considered the Arethusa-class undergunned and underprotected, a compromise too far. But Penelope had something her enemies did not. Radar. Type 284 for surface gunnery, Type 281 for air warning, Type 285 on her anti-aircraft directors. Combined with ultra-intelligence decrypts feeding precise Axis convoy schedules, this gave Force K the ability to find, track and engage targets at night while Italian warships were effectively blind. The Regia Marina had virtually no shipborne radar until 1943. Technology and training would trump tonnage. Penelope and her sister Aurora arrived at Malta on October 21, 1941, Trafalgar Day. Within weeks, they would prove every skeptic wrong. Force K's first major action was one of the most lopsided naval victories of the entire war. On the night of November 8–9, 1941, guided by aerial reconnaissance and ultra-intelligence, Force K intercepted the Italian Beta convoy. 7 merchant ships carrying 34,473 tons of munitions, fuel, and troops. 6 destroyers escorted them. Heavy cruisers Trieste and Trento provided distant cover. Aurora's radar detected the convoy at 0039 hours. Captain Agnew manoeuvred to silhouette the enemy against the moon. Force K opened fire at 0057 from 5,500 yards. Penelope fired 259 rounds of 6-inch ammunition, engaging destroyer Mistral before shifting to Fulmin. The Italian merchant captains, mistaking shell fire for an air attack, made no evasive manoeuvres. Within 45 minutes, all 7 merchant ships and destroyer Fulmin were sunk. Approximately 39,800 tons of shipping destroyed. The Italian heavy cruisers fired 207 rounds of 8-inch shell blindly into smoke. Not a single round hit. Force K suffered only minor splinter damage. Not a single British sailor was wounded. The destruction continued through November and December. Force K sank transports Maritza and Procida west of Crete on November 24. On December 1, they sank merchant vessel Adriatico, tanker Iridio Mantovani, and destroyer Alvise da Mosto. In November 1941 alone, 60% of all Axis supplies dispatched to North Africa were lost, including 92% of fuel. Count Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, wrote in his diary that Italy had given up trying to get convoys through to Libya. Force K, 2 light cruisers and 2 destroyers, had strangled the Africa Corps at a critical moment. If you are enjoying this deep dive into Royal Navy history, consider subscribing. It helps the channel and ensures you do not miss the next one. Then, disaster struck. On the night of December 18–19, 1941, Force K steamed at 28 knots into an uncharted Italian minefield 20 miles north of Tripoli. The mines had been laid months earlier, but their position had never been properly communicated to the British. Cruiser HMS Neptune struck a mine, then another while reversing, then a third, then a fourth. She rolled over and sank. Of her 764 crew, including 150 New Zealanders, only 1 man survived. Able seaman Norman Walton, rescued by Italians on Christmas Eve after 5 days adrift on a raft, watching his shipmates die one by one. Aurora was severely damaged by a mine. Destroyer Kandahar was mined trying to help Neptune and was scuttled the following day. Penelope detonated a mine in her paravane, damaging her fire control director. She stood by Neptune as long as she could before returning to Malta. Force K was finished. What followed was the most punishing chapter. With German Fliegerkorps 2 now deployed to Sicily under Kesselring, the second Luftwaffe Blitz began. Malta became the most bombed place on Earth. In April 1942 alone, 282 air raids struck the island, 4 to 10 raids daily. More bombs fell on Malta that single month than in any month of the London Blitz. On April 15, King George VI awarded Malta the George Cross, the first time the honour had been given to an entire population. Penelope fought at the Second Battle of Sirte on March 22, where 4 British light cruisers and 17 destroyers held off the Italian battleship Littorio, 2 heavy cruisers and 10 destroyers. The novelist C.S. Forrester was so inspired he dedicated his book The Ship to Penelope's officers and crew. But 4 days later, near misses holed Penelope forward and aft alongside Hamilton Wharf. She was moved into dry dock, a stationary target during the worst bombing Malta had ever experienced. For 13 days, from March 26 to April 8, Penelope's crew fought from a ship that could not sail. Gunloader Albert Hewitt was blown off his feet by a blast and regained consciousness still clutching a 4-inch shell. The ship's cat gave birth to 3 kittens during the attacks, named Bomb, Blitz and Blast. Hundreds of shrapnel holes riddled her hull above and below the waterline. With barely 1 spare welder found among the entire army garrison, the remaining holes were plugged with rough wooden blocks hammered into place. HMS Pepperpot. She was not seaworthy. The Vice Admiral Malta convened a conference. The decision was to strip Penelope of every ounce of non-essential weight, spare gear, excess crew, fresh water, surplus fittings, load just 200 tons of fuel oil and a full ammunition outfit, and run for Gibraltar. On the evening of April 8, 1942, at approximately 21:30 hours, she sailed from Malta for the last time. 9 Junkers, 88 bombers attacked the next day, 1 near miss off the starboard beam. A single Junkers 88 attacked again, bomb off the starboard bow. The steering position flooded. On April 10, at approximately 16:30 hours, she limped into Gibraltar and entered No. 2 dock. The Vice Admiral Malta signalled 2 words. True to your usual form, congratulations. She was the last major warship to leave Malta. Behind her, the toll was staggering. Destroyer HMS Legion sunk in Grand Harbour on March 26. HMS Lance destroyed by bombs in dry dock on April 5. HMS Kingston sunk by bombing on April 7. In 6 weeks, 21 Royal Navy ships were sunk in Malta's harbours and approaches. 13 more were damaged. That Penelope escaped at all, patched with wood, barely able to float, her crew exhausted, was extraordinary. After repairs at Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, Penelope returned to the Mediterranean in January 1943. She bombarded Pantelleria. She provided covering fire during the invasion of Sicily. She carried the 1st Airborne Division to Taranto. She supported the Salerno landings and fought in the Aegean, taking a direct bomb hit off Scarpanto in October 1943 that killed 12 of her crew. By February 1944, she was providing gunfire support at Anzio. On the morning of February 18, she departed Naples at 26 knots. At 0658 hours, a torpedo from U-410 struck her aft engine room. 16 minutes later, a second torpedo hit the aft boiler room. The explosion was catastrophic. She sank rapidly. Of 623 souls aboard, 417 were killed. Among them was Captain George Belbin, a veteran of the Zeebrugge raid who had won the Albert Medal for life-saving in 1918. His final act was to remain in the oil-slicked water, helping men who could not swim reach a waiting landing ship. He brought 5 ratings to safety before refusing rescue himself. He was pulled aboard but died, still covered in engine oil. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Consider what this single light cruiser achieved. Force K's 2-month rampage in late 1941 cut 60% of Rommel's supplies and 92% of his fuel. When Malta's offensive forces were suppressed by bombing in April 1942, the contrast was devastating. 150,389 tons out of 150,578 tons dispatched to North Africa arrived safely, a 99.9% delivery rate. That is how much Malta mattered. That is how much Force K mattered. Penelope fired 259 rounds in a single engagement that sank 7 merchant ships and a destroyer without suffering a single casualty. She survived an uncharted minefield that killed 763 men on Neptune. She endured 2,000 bomber sorties while immobilised in dry dock, firing 75,000 rounds in self-defence. She escaped Malta patched with wooden pegs when 21 other warships around her were sunk or destroyed. She was outgunned on paper by every enemy cruiser she faced. 57mm of belt armour against Italian cruisers carrying 70mm belts with 35mm inner bulkheads. 6 guns against 8 or 9. 5,220 tons against ships displacing 7,500 or 8,300. But the Italian heavy cruisers Trieste and Trento, with all their tonnage and firepower, fired 207 rounds at Force K without a single hit. Penelope, with her radar and her fire control, helped sink an entire convoy in 45 minutes. The specifications tell one story, the combat record tells another. The town of Blackpool adopted Penelope during Warship Week in December 1941 and raised over £1.5 million for the war effort, far exceeding the £1 million target. Blackpool still holds annual memorial services on the nearest Sunday to February 18th. The novelist C.S. Forrester dedicated the ship to her crew while she was still fighting, recognition in real time that something extraordinary was happening aboard this battered cruiser. Captain Nicholl, who brought her through Malta, said after the sinking that she was dear to the hearts of every man who served aboard her. Of the 4 Arethusa-class sisters, only 2 survived the war. Galatea was torpedoed off Alexandria with the loss of 470 men. Arethusa was shattered by a torpedo that blew a 53 by 35-foot hole in her hull, but she was saved, repaired, and went on to carry King George VI to Normandy on D-Day. Aurora, the Silver Phantom, steamed over 201,000 miles and fired over 9,000 rounds before being sold to China in 1948. These were the ships the critics called Undergunned. HMS Penelope began as a treaty compromise, a light cruiser stripped of a turret to save weight. She ended as proof that British naval excellence was never about having the biggest guns or the thickest armour. It was about innovation under pressure, practical engineering, radar that gave sight in the darkness, and crews who refused to accept that their ship was finished. They plugged the holes with wood and sailed her out of the most bombed place on Earth. That is the Royal Navy. That is HMS Pepperpot.